Ukraine just sank Russia's $500 million drone ship in the very heart of the Caspian Sea, August 14, 2025. The Port Olia 4, stretching 112 meters and carrying over 4,200 tons of Iranian drone parts and munitions, was supposed to fuel weeks of strikes. Instead, it became a fireball on the horizon, collapsing into the water before noon. This wasn't chance. It was a masterstroke of timing and precision, a strike that didn't just destroy a ship, but shattered the illusion of safety in Russia's own backyard. The Caspian, once considered a sanctuary, had turned into a battlefield. So the question is, if Ukraine can sink a fortress this far inland, what else might fall next? Stay with me and subscribe, because the most decisive battles are no longer fought where anyone expects. 5 hours earlier, the Caspian wore its usual calm, a flat sheet of bullet-black water under a weak dawn. On a dozen analyst screens, a single dot refused to be ordinary. The Port Olia 4. 112 meters of steel, some 4,200 tons of cargo, and a hull list that told a story of cautious routing. To anyone walking the decks, it was a routine job. To the eyes watching from orbit, it was a loaded ledger of intent. Commercial SAR passes lit up like heartbeat traces. Small differences mattered. Anchor angle, the way the hatch covers sat, a shadow near the superstructure. In the feeds, technicians stacked image on image, and a map of windows opened a predictable drift, a 4-hour anchorage. Somewhere in those hours, decisions hardened into timing. Inside a quiet operations room, a dozen voices moved in measured chords. Not a shout, a cadence. Confirm, hold, wait. The cargo manifest, when cross-checked, read like a grim inventory. Thousands of avionics modules, stacks of navigation units, crates labeled generically but heavy enough to feed weeks of strikes. The totals were staggering. Over 3,500 finished components and hundreds of tons of explosive material in sealed containers, enough to rewrite a campaign's tempo. If you had been watching then, you would have felt the air change, from ordinary to watchful, from routine to inevitable. The last hours before dawn were anything but ordinary. In a sealed operations room, walls glowed with maps and streams of data. Every detail was checked again and again. 16 unmanned platforms stood ready, 2 configured as silent relays. The target was fixed, a single cargo ship resting in the Caspian, its steel hull masking a fortune in war material. The moment of action had been set, 5:45 a.m. On the manifest, one line carried more weight than any weapon. Inside the hold were 3,800 avionics modules, more than 420 tons of munitions, and crates marked as navigation assemblies. Analysts did the math. Enough to produce over 400 Shahed-class systems and fuel weeks of bombardment. Those numbers were chilling, because in modern war, logistics can be more decisive than firepower. The operators weren't rushing. Their calm was sharper than panic, their silence louder than any command. Across monitors, synthetic aperture radar confirmed the anchorage. Signals intelligence marked the ship's low-emission profile. Everything matched. There would be no second chance. And somewhere between those quiet confirmations, a thought settled in. The Caspian had been called untouchable. But what if distance no longer meant safety? What if the map itself could be rewritten in one morning? If you were watching those screens, would you give the order, or hesitate? Tell me below, and make sure you subscribe so you'll be here when the first strike tears through the silence. At 10:28 a.m., the Caspian's silence cracked. The first blast tore through the aft ventilation shaft, peeling away thin steel plates like paper. Smoke rose instantly, curling into the morning sky. Within seconds, a second strike slammed into the starboard waterline, forcing seawater into the lower decks. What had been a steady hull only minutes before was now bleeding strength into the sea. By 10:30, 2 more impacts followed. One exploded against a cargo hatch, scattering burning fragments across the midsection. Another punched into the portside waterline, opening a jagged wound. The ship listed slightly 3 degrees at first, then 5, enough for alarms to shriek across the bridge. Electrical panels crackled, lights dimmed, and control circuits began to fail. At 10:31, a strike hit the bow beneath the navigation deck. Sparks lit the bridge before the screens went black. Main power died, leaving only backup batteries flickering. Fires now spread across multiple compartments, each one feeding the next. The crew scrambled, fighting smoke and heat, their voices drowned by the sound of failing machinery. Between 10:33 and 10:36, 3 more explosions ripped into the starboard hull. The impacts fractured bulkheads and widened existing tiers. Seawater surged faster, flooding 6 compartments in under 4 minutes. Pumps strained, but capacity was overwhelmed. By 10:38, the list deepened to 7 degrees, the ship's balance slipping away. 2 defenders managed to down incoming drones, but the effort came too late. By then, 9 strikes had already crippled the vessel. Fire, smoke, and flooding formed a chain reaction no damage control team could contain. The Caspian's safe harbor was no longer safe, it was becoming a graveyard of steel, and the morning had only just begun. At 10:40 a.m., the assault pressed deeper. Another detonation ripped through the stern shaft tunnel, rupturing propulsion lines and spilling fuel across the deck. Flames leapt high, carried by the wind, igniting cable trays and coating the superstructure in black smoke. What began as isolated fires now merged into a single storm, stretching from bow to stern. Within minutes, the cascading damage accelerated. Water surged through torn bulkheads, spreading into compartments untouched just moments earlier. By 10:44, more than 8 separate compartments were flooding, pumps sputtering as pressure gauges dipped into the red. The ship's list grew sharper 11 degrees, then 13, pushing the crew past the point of recovery. At 10:46, another strike slammed into the midship belt, driving steel inward and snapping structural beams. The hull groaned under the strain, audible even above the roar of fire. Lifeboats were lowered hastily. Sailors clung to rails slick with oil and seawater. From the shoreline, smoke plumes rose thick enough to be spotted over 12 kilometers away. Attempts at rescue faltered. Tugboats moving to assist were blocked by barrier detonations, plumes of spray and shrapnel marking their approach lanes. With no clear path forward, they hung back, forced to watch as the vessel succumbed. By 10:50, the ship's fate was sealed. Fire suppression systems had collapsed, power lines were dead, and the hull itself was tearing apart under asymmetric flooding. In less than 20 minutes, the Port Olia 4 had shifted from a cargo-laden fortress into a wreck adrift. Every blast, every fracture, every spreading flame formed a sequence of dominoes. And now, with the vessel crippled beyond recovery, the Caspian bore witness to a truth Moscow had never prepared for. Its supposed sanctuary was collapsing in real time. At 10:52 a.m., distress signals finally pierced the static. 2 tugboats and a patrol craft surged from the nearest port, their wakes slicing white against the blackened horizon. But the closer they came, the clearer the futility became. The Port Olia 4 was no longer a ship. It was a burning silhouette, its decks fractured, its hull sagging. By the time the first tug reached visual range, secondary blasts erupted along the approach lanes. Explosive barriers forced the vessels to veer off, geysers of water and debris cutting across their bows. Rescue crews could only circle at a distance, watching as the firestorm consumed the freighter. On board, the crew abandoned ship. Lifeboats splashed into oily waters, their bright orange canopies vanishing quickly into smoke. Of the nearly 60 sailors stationed aboard, dozens fought to escape through hatches half flooded, their exits narrowing with each passing minute. By 10:58, more than 70% of compartments were submerged, sealing off any chance of regaining control. The ship listed further, 15 degrees, and climbing as seawater poured through ruptured seams. Flames reached the forward superstructure, melting fixtures and collapsing ladders. Rescue teams tried again, inching closer, but the heat drove them back. At 11:05 a.m., the captain's final order was given: abandon ship, all hands. The vessel that had carried thousands of components meant for weeks of strikes was now left to its fate, burning and broken in the heart of the Caspian. By 2:45 p.m., the Caspian sky carried proof no denial could erase. Satellite passes captured the wreck from orbit, a 112-meter hull lying on its side, smoke still curling from ruptured decks. Synthetic aperture radar confirmed what optical lenses revealed. The Port Olia 4 had slipped beneath the surface, its stern protruding briefly before vanishing. The images spread quickly. Open-source analysts cross-referenced coastal cranes, breakwaters, and even lampposts to geolocate the wreck. Their verdict was undeniable. What Moscow first called minor damage was, in fact, the total loss of a vessel carrying more than 4,200 tons of military cargo. Subsequent passes showed detail more striking still. Scorched lifeboats floated adrift. Oil slicks stretched over 3 kilometers, staining the Caspian in shifting ribbons of black. Plumes of smoke were visible from 15 kilometers inland, drifting across coastal villages that had never expected to witness war so close. On August 15th, Ukraine's general staff confirmed what the world already knew. The Port Olia 4 had been sunk in a coordinated strike. Follow-up imagery 5 days later showed salvage cranes hovering, but little progress made. Divers reported twisted beams and collapsed cargo hatches, making recovery nearly impossible. The evidence was overwhelming. What had been billed as a safe anchorage was now a graveyard, and the Caspian, once untouched by conflict, had become a new front line visible to every eye watching from space. The scale of the loss was not measured only in steel and fire, but in what lay beneath the waves. The Port Olia 4 had been carrying enough material to assemble nearly 450 Shahed-class systems fuselages, guidance units and power supplies packed into reinforced crates. Each drone, once complete, could carry a warhead of 40 kilograms, meaning that in one strike, over 18,000 kilograms of potential payloads had been erased from the battlefield. For Russia, the consequences spread quickly. Assembly plants that had relied on steady shipments from Iran faced sudden silence. Without avionics modules, production slowed to a crawl. Stockpiles meant for nightly bombardments dwindled, forcing planners to cut strike schedules. By the third week after the sinking, launches of long-range drones dropped by more than 40%, a disruption visible in frontline reports. The economic ripples followed. Insurance markets raised war risk premiums on Caspian shipping by 30% overnight, while convoys began sailing under false call signs, their transponders switched off in fear. Each workaround added cost, delay, and exposure. For Ukraine, the victory was more than symbolic. It wasn't just a ship that had been sunk, but an entire month of planned strikes erased in a morning. Logistics. The quiet backbone of any campaign had been severed in a single calculated blow, and with it, the myth of Caspian safety collapsed into uncertainty. The sinking of the Port Olia 4 did more than cripple supply lines, it rewrote the geography of the war. For decades, the Caspian had been treated as a closed basin, immune to outside conflict. That illusion ended the moment smoke rose above its waters. Within days, coastal states convened emergency maritime safety meetings. Officials in Baku, Ashgabat, and Tehran demanded explanations, while shipping companies quietly recalculated risks. Port turnover times stretched by 20–25%, convoys queued for inspection, and war risk premiums climbed even higher. The once busy Volga-Caspian Canal slowed to a crawl. Numbers told the story more clearly than words. Salvage experts estimated losses exceeding $520 million, not counting the cost of disrupted supply. Overland routes, hastily opened as alternatives, increased transit times by up to 40%, leaving cargo vulnerable and exposed. Each deviation added kilometers of risk across territories where surveillance was constant and concealment impossible. Diplomatic ripples spread just as fast. Neutral traders, once comfortable under Russian contracts, began withdrawing vessels. Satellite images confirmed that by late August, traffic density across the northern Caspian had dropped by nearly 35%, a shift unprecedented in decades of regional trade. For Moscow, the message was brutal in its simplicity. No rear area was untouchable. The Caspian, once its quiet harbor, had turned into contested space. And every ship that sailed its waters now carried not just cargo, but the shadow of what happened to the Port Olia 4. In the weeks that followed, the echoes of the Port Olia 4's destruction lingered far beyond the wreck itself. Russian planners scrambled to reroute supply chains, shifting shipments to overland convoys through the Caucasus. But each detour added over 600 extra kilometers and days of delay, while convoys exposed themselves to surveillance drones and satellite eyes. Production schedules faltered. What once delivered hundreds of Iranian components per month now trickled in at a fraction of that pace. By early September, intelligence reports suggested a backlog of nearly 1,200 unfinished drone frames waiting for missing parts. Each day lost meant fewer strikes launched, fewer salvos against Ukrainian cities, and growing frustration in Moscow's command corridors. At sea, fear itself became a weapon. Captains dimmed their lights, sailed under borrowed call signs, and cut AIS transponders. Yet satellite imagery betrayed the truth. By mid-month, traffic density in the Caspian had dropped by 40%, a collapse unseen in modern records. This was the deeper victory. Ukraine had not only sunk a vessel, it had punctured the very idea of safe distance. Every ship that now left port carried the same invisible question. When would the next swarm arrive, and could anything stop it? The sinking of the Port Olia 4 was more than a tactical strike. It was a turning point. In a single morning, Ukraine transformed the Caspian from a sheltered backwater into contested water, exposing that no sea, no canal, no harbor is beyond reach. The loss was counted not only in steel and cargo but in momentum. Over 4,000 tons of components, hundreds of drones erased before they ever took flight, and weeks of strikes silenced before they began. But beyond numbers lies the message that modern war is no longer defined by distance, but by precision, timing, and the resolve to strike where the enemy feels untouchable. The Caspian's calm has been broken, and its waters now carry uncertainty. So, what do you think? Could this be the moment that forces Moscow to rethink its entire strategy? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the stories that shape tomorrow's headlines.